Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a movement that, well, it really shook up the art world, didn't it? Splashed vibrant colors and bold ideas all over the 20th century.
It absolutely did. A real game changer.
Now, when you hear pop art, I bet what immediately springs to mind are names like Andy Warhol, with his famous soup cans.
The soup cans. Iconic.
Or maybe Roy Lichtenstein in those dramatic comic book panels.
Right. Big, bold images.
And because of that, most people probably think pop art started squarely in the USA. Like it's this distinctly American thing, brash, loud, commercial, born out of American consumerism.
And that's such a common thought, isn't it? But the reality, well, it's actually far more interesting and definitely a bit more complex.
Go on.
Well, while American pop art definitely grabbed the headlines and, captured the public imagination in a huge way, the movement itself, it was truly a global thing. It wasn't just happening in one country. It popped up, you could say, almost simultaneously in both the United Kingdom and the United States. This was back in the late 1950s, and then it really took off in the early 1960s.
Simultaneously. Wow. So it wasn't like one place just copied the other.
Not entirely, no. It was more like two different cultural environments gave birth to a kind of shared idea around the same time. Parallel development, really.
That's fascinating. Like the cultural mood was just right for it on both sides of the Atlantic.
Exactly. The time was right.
So, okay, our mission today then is to really unpack this. Look at the origins, the core ideas, and the really influential artists from both Britain and America.
Yeah, how they challenged the old ways, embraced everyday stuff.
Right. How they took things like ads and comics and turned them into art, and how they just changed everything. We want to get beyond just the famous pictures and dig into the why behind it all. What did it all mean then, and maybe what does it mean now?
It's a great journey to take because pop art, even though it often looks playful and, really accessible on the surface.
Yeah, bright colors, familiar images.
Exactly. But underneath, it was often deeply analytical, quite critical of the society it was mirroring. We'll look at how these artists were responding to this new world, just saturated with mass media and consumer goods.
And turning that into art.
Turning those very things into groundbreaking art. It's kind of a shortcut to understanding why a soup can suddenly become as valid an art subject as, say, a landscape painting or a classical portrait.
And what that shift tells us about society and maybe about ourselves too.
Precisely.
Okay, let's get into this transatlantic birth then. As you said, it emerged in the UK and the US mid to late 50s, basically sticking it to the established fine art traditions.
Definitely a challenge to the status quo.
But even though it happened in both places, the vibes, the approaches, they were quite different.
Oh, very distinct. It's like two sides of the same coin, yeah. But minted in totally different environments, facing different immediate pressures.
Right.
So in Britain, pop art really grew out of, believe it or not, academic discussions, more intellectual, often theoretical.
Really? Academic? That sounds less splashy than Warhol.
Well, it was less about direct immersion in the culture and more about a thoughtful, almost critical look from maybe a bit of a distance. British artists and intellectuals were looking at American popular culture, the movies, the ads, the music, and they had this mix of feelings, sort of romanticizing it, a bit sentimental, definitely finding humor in it. But at the same time, they were quite analytical, maybe even critical of its power, its manipulative side.
So they were dissecting it, like cultural anthropologists watching this big, loud American thing from afar.
That's a great way to put it. They were fascinated by the energy, the newness, but also a bit wary of how pervasive and commercial it all was.
Okay, so if the British were being analytical from a distance, what about the Americans? They were in it, right?
Totally in it. A huge contrast. American artists weren't observing mass culture from the outside. They were living and breathing it day in, day out.
Bombarded.
Exactly. So American pop art was much more of a direct, almost gut-level reaction against the art style that was dominant just before it. Abstract expressionism.
Pollock,
Yeah.
Rothko,
Yeah.
all that intense, emotional, abstract stuff.
Precisely. That movement was all about deep personal feelings, the artist's inner soul, expressed through these very gestural, spontaneous brushstrokes.
Very serious.
Very serious, very personal. American pop artists looked at the world around them full of ads, products, media images, and they went the other way. Their art became bolder, maybe more aggressive, often very deliberately impersonal.
Impersonal? How so?
They wanted to kind of neutralize that painterly looseness, that intense personal feeling of abex, as they called it, moved towards something cooler, more objective, that kind of mirrored the look and feel of mass-produced stuff.
Gotcha. So it's like the Brits were saying, let's analyze this American stuff, while the Americans were saying, okay, this is our world, let's make art out of it, using its own visual language.
That captures it perfectly. It's like reading a guidebook to a city versus actually living there and navigating the streets every day.
Yeah, okay. And you mentioned that even before this main wave in the late 50s, there were earlier hints, seeds of pop art being planted.
Oh, absolutely. Elements of what we now call pop were definitely bubbling up earlier. A kind of proto-pop art, if you like, laying some conceptual groundwork.
Before it even had the name pop art. Tell me more.
Well, over in Europe, you had artists like Marcel Duchamp, Man Ray, Francis Picabia. They were exploring themes related to capitalism and modern life way before the 50s.
Duchamp, the urinal guy.
That's the one. His famous ready-mades, like Fountain from 1917, just a standard urinal he bought, signed R. Mutt, and called art.
Still controversial?
It was and is, but it directly challenged what art could even be, how it was valued. He took an ordinary mass-produced thing and made it art just by, choosing it and putting it in an art context. That directly foreshadows pop art's embrace of the everyday object.
Okay, that makes sense. Questioning the whole idea of the unique handmade artwork.
Exactly. And even in the U.S., much earlier, back in the 1920s, you had artists like Stuart Davis, Gerald Murphy, Patrick Henry Bruce, Charles Demuth.
Wow, the 20s.
Yeah, they were making paintings that included imagery from pop culture, mundane things, commercial products, advertising designs, really prefiguring the movement.
Any specific examples?
Sure. Think of Charles Demuth's I Saw the Figure. I Saw the Figure 5 in gold from 1928. It's based on a poem, but visually it uses this fragment to number 5, like from a fire engine, big typography. It feels almost like a dynamic billboard.
Huh, I could picture that.
Or Stuart Davis's painting Lucky Strike from 1921. It literally incorporates the branding from a Lucky Strike cigarette pack right into the composition.
No way, in 1921.
Yep, using commercial design and fine art. So these ideas, this visual language from the street, from the marketplace, it was already catching artists' eyes long before pop art became a movement.
That's incredible. So it wasn't just a sudden flash in the pan of the 50s. It had these deeper roots tied to how society was changing with mass production and consumer culture.
Definitely had roots. It shows that the conditions for pop art were brewing for a while. These earlier artists were sort of, tilling the soil, preparing the ground for the big shifts to come.
Right, setting the stage. Okay, let's zoom back in on the British side then, because you said it was more of an intellectual catalyst. Ideas maybe being just as important as the final painting.
They absolutely were. The thinking behind it, the philosophy, was crucial for British pop. And it really kicked off with this group called the Independent Group, or the IG. They formed in London in 1952.
The Independent Group.
Yeah. This bunch of young painters, sculptors, architects, writers, critics. They're widely seen as the direct precursor to the whole pop art movement. They weren't just making art, they were theorizing about culture.
Like a creative think tank.
Yeah.
Challenging the old guard.
Precisely. Their goal was to question the dominant modernist approaches and the very traditional, often kind of snobby views of fine.
Elitist, maybe?
Yeah, elitist. They felt the mainstream art world was too cut off from real, everyday life. They wanted to bring popular culture in, not just as a novelty, but as a valid source for art, for commentary. Pretty radical for post-war Britain.
Who are the key players in this independent group?
Well, you had pioneering artists like Richard Hamilton and Eduardo Palazzi, and really important critics like Lawrence Alloway and Rainer Banham, who helped shape the ideas. Even an architect, Colin St. John Wilson, was involved.
A diverse group. And what kind of stuff were they looking at? Not Greek myths, I'm guessing.
Definitely not. They radically embraced popular culture as their source material. That was the big break. Advertising, car design, sci-fi comics, movies, even technical manuals and pulp magazines.
Wow, anything and everything.
Pretty much. They saw this stuff not as lowbrow trash, but as powerful forms of communication, reflections of this new, fast-paced, consumer-driven world. And they thought art had to engage with it. It was an intellectual exploration of modern life itself.
Which leads us to that exhibition. This is tomorrow, in 1956. That sounds like a real moment.
It was huge. A groundbreaking show at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, kind of the public launch of these pop ideas. It wasn't just paintings on a wall. Artists worked in teams to create these immersive environments exploring mass media, tech, daily life.
Sounds intense.
It was collaborative and forward-looking. And Lawrence Alloway, the critic, summed up their attitude perfectly. He said, and this is a great quote, We felt none of the dislike of commercial culture standard among most intellectuals, but accepted it as fact, discussed it in detail, and consumed it enthusiastically.
Wow. Consumed it enthusiastically. That just flips the script entirely on that typical intellectual attitude of looking down on popular stuff.
Completely. They weren't rejecting it, they were diving in, analyzing it, even celebrating aspects of it.
And then Richard Hamilton, one of the key artists, he actually wrote down a list, like defining what pop art is.
He did. In 1957, he wrote this letter outlining the characteristics. It's become this iconic checklist for pop art. He said pop art should be popular for a mass audience, transient short-term, fleeting, expendable, easily forgotten, low-cost, mass-produced, young, aimed at youth, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, and maybe the kicker, big business.
That list is amazing. Transient, expendable, low-cost, mass-produced. That's the total opposite of traditional fine art values like timelessness and uniqueness.
Exactly. He was nailing the characteristics of the consumer culture itself, and big business really highlights that commercial engine driving it all. Art couldn't ignore consumerism anymore. It was like he saw planned obsolescence coming to art itself.
Incredible foresight. He recognized that maybe art reflecting this fast-paced throwaway culture shouldn't pretend to be eternal in the old way.
Right. It opened the door for art to be more nimble, more responsive to the now. Now, speaking of defining things, there's always a bit of back and forth about who actually coined the term pop art.
Ah, yes, the naming rights. What's the story there?
Well, it's a bit fuzzy, which kind of shows these ideas were just, floating around. Many people credit Lawrence Alloway, the British critic.
Okay.
But Eduardo Paolozzi, another IG artist, made a collage way back in 1947 called I Was a Rich Man's Plaything. And in that collage, there's a gun firing, and the smoke cloud literally has the word P.O.P. written in it.
1947. So the word was in the art years before the movement had a name.
Exactly. Pretty wild. Then two other IG members, Allison and Peter Smithson, actually used the term pop art in print in an article in 1956 called But Today We Collect Ads.
Okay, so it's definitely circulating within that group.
It seems so. Alloway gets a lot of credit because he wrote an influential essay in 1958 called The Arts and the Mass Media, where he used the phrase popular mass culture. Initially, he meant the media products themselves, like movies and ads, but later, in the mid-60s, he clarified that he also intended it for the art that drew inspiration from that culture. By then, of course, pop art was already a big deal.
So the term emerged organically from the scene itself. Let's talk about some other British artists who really took these ideas and ran with them, turning the theory into art.
Absolutely. Beyond Hamilton and Paolozzi, you have someone like Peter Blake. His work often has this real warmth, almost an innocence. He celebrated youth culture, drawing imagery from comic books, posters, fairgrounds, wrestling.
Sounds quite nostalgic, maybe.
Yeah, there's often a sense of affection for the source material. He wasn't always being ironic. Think of his self-portrait with badges from '61 covered in Elvis pins and things, or his collage-like works integrating found objects.
And he did the album cover, right? The Beatles one.
That's him. Along with John Hayworth, he designed the Spate Peppers' Lonely Hearts Club Band cover in 1967. An absolute icon of British pop art, that collage of famous faces and objects. It perfectly captured that pop spirit and, crucially, reached millions of people. It wasn't just art for galleries.
A true blurring of lines between art and mass media. And we definitely need to mention Pauline Boddy.
Oh, absolutely crucial. Pauline Boddy stands out as the only prominent British female pop artist of that initial wave.
Which says a lot about the time, sadly.
It really does. And her work often had a sharper, more critical edge, sometimes with feminist undertones. She'd use images of female icons like Marilyn Monroe, but in a way that questioned their objectification in media. Works like The Only Way to Go from '63 are really powerful commentaries on female representation, using the glossy language of popular culture to critique it from within.
A really important perspective. And then there was another exhibition, Young Contemporaries, in 1961. Sounds like the next generation arrived.
It was exactly that, a really important show featuring this new wave of artists, mostly from the Royal College of Art. It put people like David Hockney on the map.
Hockney, of course.
And R.B. Kitaj, Peter Phillips, Alan Jones, Derek Boshier, Patrick Caulfield, a really strong group. They all had their own takes on pop, from Hockney's more personal narrative style to Kitaj's complex intellectual stuff.
So British pop wasn't just one thing. Lots of individual voices.
Definitely. And interestingly, the guy who designed the posters for those shows, Billy Apple, he later moved to New York and got involved in the American scene, shows those transatlantic links again.
It's fascinating how the British side was so rooted in these intellectual discussions, laying down a framework even as things were about to explode visually in America.
Yeah, the independent group really proved pop wasn't just about bright colors. It was a fundamental shift in thinking about what art could engage with. Embracing the everyday, the commercial, it was a conscious choice.
Okay, let's cross the Atlantic then into the American explosion. Because here the engagement felt less like analysis and more like full immersion, boldness, repetition, huge scale.
Absolutely. As we touched on, American pop was a direct counterpunch to abstract expressionism, where AbEx was all about the artist's inner world and unique gesture.
Pog art was about the outer world, the world of stuff.
Pretty much. It marked a big return to recognizable images, representational art, but often with this cool, detached, impersonal approach. It was like they wanted to erase the artist's emotional fingerprint, mimicking the anonymity of mass production.
Less angst, more billboards.
Kind of, yeah. Less soul-searching, more reflecting the surface of consumer culture, but often finding depth in that surface. And this really started gaining momentum in the early 60s.
How did it get introduced? Were there key shows that really launched it in the U.S.?
There were some important early gallery shows. The Judson Gallery showed artists like Jim Dine and Claes Oldenburg in 59, 60. Then the Green Gallery was big, showing Rosenquist, Segal, Oldenburg again between 1960 and 64.
So bubbling up in the galleries.
Yeah, but the term pop art got its official big-time introduction in December 62. The Museum of Modern Art, MoMA, held a symposium on pop art.
MoMA, that's a major stamp of approval, even if it was debated.
Huge deal. It put pop art firmly on the institutional map, although, yeah, a lot of critics were outraged. And right around then, out on the West Coast, Walter Hopps curated a show called New Painting of Common Objects at the Pasadena Art Museum. That's seen as the first pop art museum exhibition in America. Showed Warhol, Lichtenstein, Ed Ruscha.
Okay, so the movement had arrived.
Right.
Let's talk about the titans. The names everyone knows. Got to start with Andy Warhol. Icon of repetition, commodification. He seemed to live the pop life.
Warhol is definitely the most famous, and he really did blur those lines. Artist, celebrity, brand, artwork, it all kind of merged. What's interesting about him is this seeming lack of human affectation, as some called it. He often ditched the obvious irony or parody you saw in other pop artists.
More deadpan.
Yeah, almost like a neutral observer, just holding up a mirror to consumer culture, saying, here it is, look at it, and leaving you to figure out what to think.
And repetition was key for him, like hammering it home.
Totally central. He used repetition to talk about mass production, about consumerism. He famously arranged his paintings in grids, like products stacked on supermarket shelves.
Turning the gallery into a grocery store aisle.
Exactly. And by doing that, he was asking big questions. If art looks like it came off a factory line, what does that mean for the idea of the unique artistic genius? He was messing with the whole aura of the artwork. And by repeating an image like Marilyn Monroe's face or a soup can over and over, he kind of drained its emotional power, maybe showing how media saturation numbs us.
Like those Campbell soup cans. You see one, okay, you see 32, it becomes something else.
Precisely. His Campbell's Soup Eye series from 68, or all those Coca-Cola bottles, taking these utterly mundane, mass-produced things and treating them like high art subjects, not necessarily to celebrate them, but to make us think about how omnipresent they are, how consumerism shapes our world.
And he did it with celebrities too, right? Treating them like products.
Yeah, repeating images of Marilyn, Elvis, Jackie O, turning fame itself into another commodity, just like soup, highlighting the manufactured nature of celebrity.
And his technique, switching to screen printing. That was part of the message too.
Absolutely. Moving away from hand painting was a conscious choice. Screen printing was cheaper, faster, and it emphasized mass production. It was a direct rejection of that traditional idea of the artist's unique touch, the genius's hand.
Like he wanted to be a machine, as he famously said.
Exactly. He wanted to remove the personal, subjective element, directly opposing the abstract expressionists. For him, paintings could be like consumer goods.
And that soup can show in 62 at Ferris Gallery. That was the big bang.
That was pretty much it. 32 canvases, each a different Campbell's soup variety, lined up like in a store. It instantly made him famous, sparked huge debates. Critics were divided. The public was intrigued. It was a defining moment.
From soup to superstardom. Okay, next up. Roy Lichtenstein, master of the comic strip look. He got a lot of flack, right, for copying comics.
Oh, he was a lightning rod for criticism, but also a total pioneer. His signature style, those crisp, hard-edged paintings based on comics, ads, sometimes even other art. instantly recognizable.
The Ben-Day dots, the bold outlines.
Exactly, mimicking the look of cheap printing. But crucially, he wasn't just copying. That's the misconception.
Right, so what was he doing?
He was transforming the source material. He'd crop images, change compositions, alter colors, even tweak the text in the speech bubbles to create something new, often amplifying the drama or the emotion.
And the dots. You mentioned something amazing about the dot.
Yeah, this is brilliant. He hand-painted the Ben-Day dots meticulously. He used perforated screens sometimes, but it was still a very deliberate, controlled, hand-done process to recreate the look of mechanical reproduction.
Wow. So he's using intense hand labor to make something look machine-made. That's meta.
Totally meta. It forces you to think about originality, reproduction, high art, low art, all those boundaries he was blurring.
Drowning Girl is maybe his most famous. That intense emotion, but in a comic style.
A classic example. From 1963. He took a panel from a DC romance comic, but he cropped out the boyfriend who was originally in the picture, focusing entirely on the crying girl and her dramatic thought. I don't care. I'd rather sink than call Brad for help.
Makes it even more intense somehow.
It does. And by blowing it up to a huge scale, painting it meticulously, he elevates this seemingly disposable comic image, making us reconsider its emotional power and artistic potential. Is he mocking it, celebrating it? He leaves it open.
And he didn't just stick to comics.
No, he branched out. He did landscapes using industrial materials like shiny plastic, Rolux to mimic texture and movement, and then his fantastic brushstroke series from the mid-60s.
Where he paints a brushstroke.
Exactly. He took the ultimate symbol of abstract expressionist spontaneity and feeling the expressive brushstroke and painted it in his cool, hard-edged comic book style, like it was a logo or a cartoon, a really witty critique of the art movement he was reacting against.
That's brilliant, taking their symbol and turning it into pop.
And he did sculpture, too, playing with flatness and perspective, making 3D objects look like 2D drawings, always questioning how we see.
It seems like pop, even when it looks simple, was always asking complex questions about art and reality. Okay, James Rosenquist, the billboard painter who became a fine artist. That's a cool backstory.
Isn't it? He literally painted giant ads in Times Square. Shenley whiskey, Camel cigarettes. He said he could paint a bottle in his sleep, and he brought that commercial sensibility, the huge scale, the bright colors, the way ads juxtapose different images right into his fine art.
Taking the language of Madison Avenue into the gallery, what was his main technique?
He was known for these massive canvases featuring fragmented, often jarringly juxtaposed images taken from ads and pop culture. A piece of spaghetti next to a car grill next to a woman's face.
Surreal collage, almost.
Yeah, very much like a surreal collage, but painted on a monumental scale. He'd often start with actual small collages of magazine clippings and then blow them up into these enormous paintings. It forces you to confront these everyday disposable images in a completely different, often unsettling way.
Any keywords we should know?
Well, Zone from '61 is seen as his first real pop piece, showing that fragmented style. Then there's President-elect from 1960-61, really famous. It combines a portrait of JFK from his campaign, looking all wholesome, with a picture of a hand holding a slice of cake, like from an ad, and a section of a Chevrolet car.
Cake, cars, and Kennedy. What was he saying?
Rosenquist said he was interested in how politicians were being advertised like consumer goods, packaging themselves, selling an image, really sharp commentary on politics and consumerism merging.
Wow, that still feels relevant today.
Totally. And then his absolute epic is F-111 from 1965. It's enormous, over 80 feet long, wraps around the room.
80 feet.
Yeah. It shows a life-size F-111 fighter jet. This was peak Vietnam War era, remember, interwoven with images of consumer stuff. Tires, cake, light bulbs, spaghetti, a little girl under a salon hairdryer.
A fighter jet and spaghetti. That's intense.
Incredibly intense. He called it a critique of the collusion between the Vietnam death machine, consumerism, the media, and advertising. It's this overwhelming visual experience that crashes the banality of consumer culture right into the horror of modern warfare.
That must have hit hard back then. A really powerful piece.
Hugely powerful. Rosenquist really pushed pop art into social and political commentary using that unique billboard aesthetic. He gained international fame and kept working on a large scale.
Okay, one more American giant. Claes Oldenburg, the sculptor. He took pop into 3 dimensions, often with humor.
Oldenburg is fantastic. One of the few pop artists really focused on sculpture. He's famous for those huge public sculptures of everyday things and also his soft sculpture.
What was the deal with the store? That sounds wild.
The store, 1961-62, was amazing. He literally rented a shop front in New York and filled it with plaster and burlap sculptures of, like, pastries, shirts, shoes, bits of food, all painted in this gloopy, expressionistic style.
Like messy sculptures of cheap stuff.
Exactly. And he sold them for low prices, like in a real store. It completely blurred the lines between art gallery and shop, between fine art and commodity. And the messy paint was kind of a funny dig at the seriousness of abstract expressionism.
Making art accessible, tangible, and poking fun. I like it.
Yeah.
Now the soft sculptures, like a floppy hamburger.
Precisely. He started making large versions of everyday objects. Hamburgers, ice cream cones, telephones, toilets, drum kits out of materials like vinyl or canvas, stuffed so they were soft and collapsible.
Why soft? What was the point?
Well, it did a few things. It subverted the traditional idea of sculpture being hard, rigid, permanent. These things drooped, they sagged, they seemed vulnerable, almost human in a weird way. Maybe it commented on the hollowness of consumer goods, or maybe it was just playful and absurd. It definitely made you look twice at a light switch or a slice of cake.
Making the familiar completely strange. And then he went huge, right, with the public art.
Yeah, he scaled up massively, often collaborating with his wife, Kustja von Bergen. Think of the giant clothespin in Philadelphia. It's 45 feet tall.
I've seen pictures. It looks like two people embracing almost.
Some people see that. Or the Spoon Bridge in Cherry in Minneapolis, a giant spoon with the cherry balanced on it, acting as a bridge over a pond. Whimsical, fun, but also monumental.
And the dropped cone in Germany. An ice cream cone melting on a roof.
Exactly. Often these pieces got mocked at first, but then people came to love them. They inject this element of playfulness and surprise into the urban landscape. He also did performance art pieces called Happenings back in the 60s, very chaotic and multimedia, reflecting that same kind of brash, humorous energy.
So American pop really went for impact. Yeah. Scale, directness, often that cool, almost deadpan delivery, but tackling big themes about consumerism, media, even war.
Definitely. Immersed in the culture, they reflected it back in ways that were bold, often monumental, and made people see their everyday world differently.
Okay, we've covered the UK and the US, but pop art didn't just stop there, right? It went global.
Oh, yeah. The ideas resonated everywhere. The core themes, mass media, consumerism, high versus low culture, these were becoming global issues as countries modernized. So artists around the world picked up on pop concepts and adapted them.
Like in France. Nouveau Realisme.
Right. Nouveau Realism, founded around 1960 by critic Pierre Restany and artist Yves Klein. They shared that interest in commercial culture with American pop, but their focus was maybe more on the objects themselves, often found objects.
Less painting pictures of things, more using the actual things.
Kind of. Restany talked about a poetic recycling of urban, industrial, and advertising reality. Think of artists like Jacques Viglet doing décollage.
Décollage. Like the opposite of collage.
Exactly. He'd literally tear away layers of old posters ripped from city walls to reveal these fragmented images underneath, using the actual discarded media of the street as his material. Or Armin, who made accumulations, collections of identical objects like piles of clocks and teapots, commenting on mass production and waste.
A more hands-on, maybe gritty approach to the same themes. What about Germany? Capitalist realism. The name alone sounds pointed.
It does, doesn't it? Founded in '63 by Sigmar Polk, Gerhard Richter, and Konrad Lueg. They used pop aesthetics, drawing from ads, photos, but often with a much more overtly critical, maybe cynical take on consumerism, especially in post-war West Germany as it rebuilt and embraced capitalism.
More critical than American pop, which sometimes felt ambiguous or even celebratory.
Often, yeah. A cooler cynicism, maybe. Polk's work is a great example. His painting Bunnies from '66 shows Playboy bunnies, but he uses these really coarse, visible printing dots.
Like Lichtenstein's dots, but messy.
Sort of, but deliberately flawed. So the closer you get to the image, the more it dissolves into just dots. It messes with the seductive image, maybe showing a conflict between desiring the glossiness of consumer life and being repulsed by its superficiality. A real critique of how mass media manipulates desire.
Using the technique against itself. Clever. Where else did pop take root?
All over. In Japan, pop concepts had a huge influence on manga and anime. Artists like Tadanori Yoku in the '60s fused traditional Japanese art styles with modern advertising and pop culture in these amazing, vibrant posters. Later, you get Takashi Murakami and his whole super flat movement, directly merging traditional aesthetics with anime and consumerism, selling his art as high-end pieces and as merchandise. Very pop.
So a uniquely Japanese blend. Italy.
In Italy, you had artists in Rome, like Mario Schifano, part of the Scuola di Piazza del Popolo. They engaged with pop-themed logos like Coca-Cola, Esso, but often with a more painterly, expressive style. Less cool detachment, maybe more tied to Italian art history and their specific urban landscape.
And even Russia, behind the Iron Curtain. How did that work?
Fascinatingly, yes. Sauce art emerged in the Soviet Union in the 70s. It was like a Soviet pop art, using the visual language of official propaganda slogans, images of Lenin but twisting it, satirizing it. Artists like Komar and Melamed would combine Soviet symbols with consumerist ideas or mock the heroic style of socialist realism. It was incredibly subversive, applying a pop sensibility to critique a totally different political and economic system.
Wow. Using pop to critique communism instead of capitalism, that shows how adaptable the core ideas were.
Absolutely. Whether it was tearing up posters in France, cynically painting dots in Germany, blending anime in Japan, or satirizing propaganda in Russia, pop art provided a language for artists everywhere to grapple with the realities of modern mass culture in their own contexts.
What an incredible journey we've taken. From those initial intellectual debates in Britain to the brash, bold explosion in America, and then seeing it ripple out and transform across the globe, pop art really did fundamentally change the game, didn't it? Fusing high art with popular culture.
It really did. And it offered this sharp, sometimes funny, sometimes biting commentary on consumerism, media, and what it meant to be alive in the modern world.
Asking those big questions through soup cans and comic panels.
Yeah.
What even is fine art? Is art just another product? How do we deal with this flood of images constantly coming at us?
Questions that feel even more relevant today, wouldn't you say? Pop art was so incredibly ahead of its time. Think about our world now: social media, influencer culture, personal branding, AI-generated images.
Total visual saturation.
Exactly. Pop artists were grappling with the beginnings of that, the blurring lines between art and commerce, between reality and image, between the authentic and the manufactured. They saw it coming. Warhol's factory wasn't just an art studio, it was a brand, a scene, a media hub.
Lichtenstein's hand-painted mechanical dots make you think about AI art and authenticity today. Oldenburg's playful sculptures comment on desire and disposability.
They gave us the tools, the visual language, to even start thinking critically about the world we live in now, where everything feels like it's being marketed, where images are constantly manipulated, and where art pops up everywhere, not just in museums.
They showed us that the grocery aisle could be an art gallery, and maybe the art gallery was becoming a bit like a store.
The lines are well and truly blurred now.
So here's a final thought for you as you go about your day. Start noticing the art that's all around you, the stuff you might usually ignore. That product packaging on your shelf, the memes flooding your phone, the design of your favorite website, maybe even the way food is presented on a plate in an ad.
The everyday aesthetic.
How has pop art's legacy trained our eyes to see value or meaning, or maybe even a critique in all these commonplace visuals? Are we, in a way, all just living inside a giant, constantly changing pop art installation?
And if we are, what's the message of this installation right now about our own consumer age? Something to chew on.
Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for diving deep with us today.